Welcome back to Material Logic Unmasked. This podcast is for those who think complex issues don't need catchy labels. Deep state. Two words often used to explain everything and nothing. If you love oversimplifying 15 seconds geopolitics news, this is not your place. Anyway, you've probably heard of billionaires who seem different, ones who give away money, care about climate change, or speak out for fairness. They seem like the good kind. But here's the thing, even the well-meaning ones can't fix a system built to keep pushing wealth upward. It's not really about being good or bad. It's about how the system works. If you're at the top, you're pushed, forced, really to grow your wealth, no matter what. In this episode, we break down why kindness and charity don't change the rules of the game. This is the compulsion dilemma, where good intentions run into the hard logic of capitalism. Here's something that'll make you think. Warren Buffett publicly advocates for higher taxes on the wealthy. Meanwhile, Bill Gates pledges billions to combat global inequality. Yet their fortunes, they keep swelling. Now, this isn't hypocrisy. It's what Marx called the mute compulsion of economic relations. Even billionaires who see capitalism's contradictions remain trapped within its logic. Think of it this way. Imagine being on a treadmill that speeds up automatically. You can want to slow down. You can advocate for others to have slower treadmills. But if you actually slow down, you fall off. The treadmill capitalism's competitive logic keeps running regardless of your personal beliefs. So today, we're going to explore why even the most ethical billionaires cannot escape the system that created them. This is going to be revealing. The mainstream narrative positions billionaires as potential saviors, ethical elites who can reform capitalism from within. For instance, when the Gates Foundation announces major health pledges, media coverage often uses language like transformative and game-changing. But here's what's really happening. This narrative serves a crucial ideological function. It shifts our focus from questioning the system to celebrating individual virtue. Rather than asking why massive inequities exist in the first place, we applaud the generosity that treats symptoms while leaving root causes untouched. It's like, hypothetically speaking, praising someone for giving out umbrellas during a storm they helped create, while never questioning why they have the power to control the weather machine. This philanthropic pattern, it stretches back over a century. Take John D. Rockefeller's foundations, which sanitized Standard Oil's monopoly profits through universities and public health initiatives. The same playbook operates today at vastly larger scale. As a result, modern philanthropy functions as capitalism's ethical safety valve, providing moral legitimacy while preserving underlying power relations. Consequently, social problems become opportunities for elite generosity, and systemic critique gets redirected into product development. The system doesn't just tolerate moral challenges, it metabolizes them, converting ethical concerns into new forms of accumulation. That's sophisticated. Every philanthropic dollar represents a democratic deficit. In other words, private foundations allow wealthy individuals to steer public agendas without any electoral accountability. Furthermore, tax-subsidized charity channels what should be public resources through private decision-making, reducing democratic control over social spending priorities. What emerges is a perverse cycle. The same system that concentrates wealth also concentrates decision-making power. Therefore, the responses to social problems are designed by the very class whose accumulation creates those problems, ensuring that fixes address symptoms while strengthening underlying structures. The ethical billionaire represents capitalism's most sophisticated ideological innovation. Warren Buffett's advocacy for higher capital gains taxes and Bill Gates' global health mission create the impression that enlightened elites can lead transformation from above. This branding provides moral cover for wealth concentration, channels systemic critique into approved reforms, and creates aspirational models that make capitalism appear compatible with social consciousness. But here's the thing, the brand operates primarily at the narrative level, not material practice. The persistent gap between stated values and structural behavior reveals the limitations of individual morality within capitalist relations. Here's where structure reveals its constraints. The tax system structurally advantages wealth accumulation over wage income through mechanisms like preferential capital gains treatment. These aren't accidents. They reflect capitalism's built-in bias toward wealth over labor. Gates' stance on COVID vaccine intellectual property illustrates the same dynamic. Despite his positioning as a global health advocate, he initially opposed broad patent waivers that would have accelerated vaccine production globally. The conflict wasn't personal, it was structural. Monopoly logic conflicted with equity imperatives. The deeper issue isn't individual morality but surplus value extraction, the hidden engine driving all billionaire wealth accumulation. Workers produce more value through their labor than they receive in wages. This difference, the surplus value, becomes profit through normal market mechanisms, not personal greed. What becomes clear is why individual intention collapses under structural imperatives. Even billionaires who genuinely want to address inequality remain dependent on processes that generate it. The contradiction isn't personal hypocrisy, it's systemic logic operating through human agents. Marx identified capitalism's shift from visible domination to what he called the mute compulsion of economic relations. Control operates through impersonal market pressures rather than direct commands. Workers are free to sell their labor to any employer, but they're also free from owning productive assets, leaving no real alternative. The result, a paradoxical freedom, formal liberty combined with structural compulsion. Both workers and capitalists face impersonal imperatives, but experience them very differently. Even billionaires aren't gods manipulating the system from above. They're more like high-level employees serving capital's logic. Productivity continues flowing upward, while wages stagnate relative to costs. But this isn't primarily about individual greed. It's competitive logic that systematically punishes ethical behavior through market mechanisms. Companies pursuing genuinely ethical practices face higher costs than competitors who externalize social and environmental damage. The market systematically selects against virtue through competitive pressure. What emerges is capitalism's ethical trap. Virtue becomes competitive liability. Companies prioritizing stakeholder welfare over profit maximization lose market share to less scrupulous competitors. The domination goes even deeper than individual choice. It's embedded in capitalism's basic social forms: value, money, abstract labor, commodity relations. Everyone, including billionaires, becomes dominated by these abstract forces that operate through human activity but remain beyond direct control. Billionaires may appear powerful while remaining what we might call trapped executives of accumulation logic. They can choose between different accumulation strategies, but they cannot choose whether to accumulate without facing competitive elimination. Capital must continuously grow, what Marx called valorization or face collapse. This isn't greed. It's a structural survival requirement built into the system. The valorization imperative operates like a treadmill. Everyone must run faster just to maintain their relative position as baseline requirements escalate. When firms increase productivity, they initially gain competitive advantage. But as competitors adopt similar innovations, yesterday's advantage becomes today's survival requirement. The result? Perpetual intensification without corresponding benefit. The productivity paradox illustrates this dynamic. Despite massive technological improvements over recent decades, workers face intensified labor demands rather than reduced workloads. The gains flow to competitive advantage rather than human welfare because the treadmill demands continuous acceleration. Within this context, ethical business practices become cost burdens. Fair wages and environmental protections increase expenses relative to competitors who externalize these costs. All market actors face the same fundamental choice: conform to competitive imperatives or lose market position. Marx's observation that capital must grow or collapse reveals the stark reality facing all market participants. There's no neutral space for virtue within the accumulation process. Ethical considerations must be subordinated to competitive requirements or face market elimination. Billionaires may appear free due to their vast personal resources, but their business empires remain chained to the valorization treadmill. Their wealth depends on continuous surplus value extraction, making them functionally dependent on the inequality-generating processes they may personally want to reform. Warren Buffett's situation illustrates the gap between ethical rhetoric and structural reality. Despite Buffett's public advocacy for higher taxes, competitive imperatives make tax efficiency a survival requirement regardless of personal moral preferences. The structural context reveals the constraint. Capital gains face maximum taxation rates significantly lower than wage income. This isn't accidental policy. It reflects capitalism's built-in bias toward wealth accumulation over labor income. The contradiction between individual conscience and systemic compulsion demonstrates how competitive imperatives override personal preferences. Tax minimization isn't personal greed. It's competitive necessity. Companies that voluntarily pay higher taxes lose resources that competitors retain for reinvestment and expansion. The market systematically punishes voluntary tax maximization through competitive disadvantage. The pattern goes beyond individual behavior to reflect capitalism's core logic of private accumulation versus public distribution. The tax code doesn't just permit avoidance, it structurally encourages it through differential treatment of capital versus labor income. Individual cases exemplify how systemic logic operates through actors who appear to have choices, but actually face structural constraints. Personal tax advocacy can coexist with systematic tax optimization because competitive imperatives override individual moral preferences. What we see is a universal pattern. Systemic logic operates through seemingly personal decisions that actually respond to structural imperatives. The system creates legal mechanisms that allow private accumulation to avoid public claims, demonstrating how individual behaviors reflect deeper structural relationships. Let's consider a hypothetical scenario that mirrors real dynamics. Imagine a tech giant facing existential threats to its core business model. The company must pursue new accumulation frontiers when existing models face disruption. This isn't strategic choice emerging from boardroom vision, it's a survival imperative. Competitive pressure compels speculative investment in unproven technologies because standing still means falling behind. Innovation becomes compulsion rather than inspiration. Companies must find new profit sources or face gradual obsolescence. Even cutting-edge innovation often depends on traditional exploitation patterns relocated globally. Sophisticated technological facades can mask familiar extractive relationships underneath. The pivot represents reactive scrambling to maintain competitive position rather than visionary leadership. Capital's innovation imperative operates through technological development, but the underlying logic remains extractive, intensifying labor, capturing attention, converting human activity into profitable data streams. Even Silicon Valley disruptors ultimately follow accumulation logic rather than transcending it. Market valuations often depend on successfully monetizing new data streams and attention capture mechanisms. Valuations reflect expected future surplus extraction rather than current profitability, demonstrating how financial speculation drives investment decisions independently of immediate human utility. What becomes evident is a universal pattern. Even visionary leaders are running to stay ahead of the valorization treadmill. The resources and scale differ dramatically, but the underlying logic remains identical: accumulate or face competitive elimination. Consider a small garment manufacturer committed to fair wages and sustainable practices. They pay significantly higher wages while fast fashion competitors operate through exploitation and environmental externalization. This ethical commitment creates an insurmountable cost disadvantage in price-driven retail markets. The manufacturer faces a stark choice: compromise ethical standards to meet price demands or lose contracts to competitors willing to exploit workers for cost savings. The parallel extends to everyday decisions, wanting to buy ethical products, but facing budget constraints that make cheaper options necessary for survival. Markets systematically select against sustainability when innovative solutions cost more than conventional alternatives. Even companies with prominent sustainability commitments often choose cheaper alternatives when faced with competitive cost pressures and performance targets. What we observe demonstrates that even innovative, socially necessary solutions cannot survive market competition when they cannot match incumbent cost structures. The market doesn't reward virtue or environmental necessity. It systematically punishes deviation from cost optimization. Whether examining small manufacturers or large corporations, ethical actors face identical structural disadvantages: higher costs in ruthlessly price-driven markets. The scale varies dramatically, but the underlying logic operates consistently across all levels. From small manufacturers to global billionaires, all face the same fundamental choice: conform to competitive imperatives or lose market position to less scrupulous alternatives. Such universality reveals capitalism's systematic bias against virtue. The market structurally rewards exploitation while punishing alternatives. Major philanthropic commitments represent genuine moral responses to inequality's extreme manifestations. Yet these gestures coexist with contradictory positions on structural issues like intellectual property rights. The pattern reveals philanthropy's built-in structural contradictions. Philanthropic responses must remain compatible with the accumulation logic that generates the wealth funding them, or risk undermining their own financial foundation. Built-in constraints prevent charity from addressing root causes without threatening the structures that make charity possible. Tax-subsidized foundations allow wealthy individuals to steer social priorities without electoral accountability or democratic oversight. This creates a democratic deficit where private actors control resources that might otherwise be allocated through representative institutions reflecting broader public preferences. What emerges is the transformation of charity from pure altruism into power projection. Philanthropic activity operates through substantial public subsidy, making it a mechanism for converting what should be public resources into private influence over social policy. Philanthropy operates like, hypothetically speaking, donating umbrellas during a storm while maintaining control over the weather machine. It treats effects while ignoring causes, addresses symptoms while preserving the structures that generate those symptoms. The ideological function operates through moral legitimation. Philanthropy proves capitalism can be ethical by showcasing generous elites. This deflects attention from systemic causes toward individual virtue. Most sophisticatedly, philanthropy integrates ethical concerns into market logic rather than allowing them to challenge fundamental relations. Persistent tax advocacy and health initiatives from wealthy elites represent genuine expressions of moral discomfort with inequality's extreme manifestations. These aren't cynical public relations moves. They're authentic responses to ethical awareness about capitalism's harsh contradictions. Yet despite proliferating ethical gestures from the ultra-wealthy, global wealth concentration continues to accelerate. Individual moral awareness clearly exists among elites, but it demonstrably lacks structural power to alter systemic outcomes in any meaningful way. From a materialist perspective, systemic logic, not individual morality, ultimately determines historical outcomes. Social structure consistently trumps individual agency when personal choices confront institutional imperatives embedded in economic relations. Global inequality has demonstrably accelerated despite proliferating ethical billionaire narratives and unprecedented levels of philanthropic activity. The empirical pattern proves how systemic logic overwhelms individual intention when structural mechanisms remain unchanged. Individual ethics can articulate powerful critiques of capitalism's excesses and contradictions, but cannot fundamentally alter the system's structural foundations. Moral voices crying into capitalism's competitive void find only echoes of their own structural limitations bouncing back. Ethical awareness represents genuine human capacity for moral reflection, but operates within competitive parameters that severely limit transformative potential. Individual moral awareness becomes politically meaningful when connected to broader understanding of the social relations that create and maintain these ethical dilemmas. The compulsion dilemma reveals that even genuinely good billionaires remain structurally trapped within accumulation's relentless logic. Their ethical awareness exists, but operates within parameters that prevent fundamental change. Individual virtue remains important for personal integrity, but understanding structural compulsion points towards systemic rather than individual explanations. Episode 4 will examine Amazon's market dominance strategies, dynastic wealth transmission mechanisms, and how these concentrated forms of power operate through legal and financial structures that transcend individual control. Until then, stay safe and stay engaged.